Hi, everyone. So today I'll be talking about Peer-to-Peer, a Commons Manifesto by Michel Bauwens and Vasilis Kostakis, Cybernetic Revolutionaries by Eden Medina, Swarm Creativity by Peter A. Glore, and The Origin of Humanness in the Biology of Love by Umberto Maturana. So let's get started. First up is Peer-to-Peer, a Commons Manifesto. This book is about developing institutional structures to serve a greater proportion of humanity with a cooperativist or distributist bent. As such, Michel Bauwens' work reminds me a bit of book Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus by Douglas Rushkoff. But Bauwens is analytically savvy and resourceful in his own right, with his central theme being to create a new category of prosperity that is neither private nor primarily beholden to government, with a thorough exploration of the associated structures, accounting practices, and bridging mechanisms. To explain what the commons and peer-to-peer are, by this understanding, I'll just share the infographics at the end of Chapter 1. To paraphrase, the commons are 1, a system for stewarding resources according to shared values and community identity, 2, performed in such fashion as to be self-organizing, 3, held in balance and contradistinction to both market and state, 4, will be passed on to future generations, 5, a verb, namely commoning, which operationally binds a community to some kind of resource according to rules for caring for that resource. Meanwhile, peer-to-peer is 1, a type of non-coercive social relation, 2, a technological infrastructure for scaling it, 3, a mode of production that results from it, 4, a pathway towards human and ecological regeneration. They see peer-to-peer as the means for optimizing the what, who, and how of commoning, in other words, the resource, the community, and its rules. So the part I last read was Chapter 2, Peer-to-Peer and a New Ecosystem of Value Creation. Here they adopt the term Commons-Based Peer Production, or CBPP, to refer to the production paradigm under consideration, a term which they borrow from Yochai Benkler, author of The Wealth of Networks. This refers to a new pathway of value creation and distribution through which peer-to-peer infrastructure allow individuals to communicate, self-organize, and ultimately co-create non-rivalrous use value, which is more important in this ecosystem than exchange value. Rather than hiring workers in order to maximize profits, they write that commons-based peer production is in principle open to anyone with the skills to contribute to a joint project. The knowledge of every participant is pooled, and that this can be for pay, but not necessarily. Such projects are stewarded by what they call benevolent hierarchy or heterarchy. These maintainers or editors protect the integrity of the system as a whole and can refuse contributions that endanger the integrity of the system. They write that commons-based peer production is often based on stigmergic collaboration, which is when an action leaves a trace that stimulates the performance of a next action by the same or different agent. Broadly speaking, heterarchy refers to a best of both worlds scenario that combines network dynamics with hierarchical structures synergistically through feedback channels that traverse hierarchical layers, as well as the interchangeability of agents, at least in principle. Within this new ecosystem, they make the case for value sovereignty, that is, enabling communities and societies to self-determine value for themselves and develop accounting practices to allow this recognition to take place, suggesting an increase in heterogeneity. This kind of ecosystem would consist of 3 parts: the productive community, the commons-oriented entrepreneurial coalitions, and the for-benefit association. And they share this table of existing examples: Linux, Mozilla, GNU, Wikipedia, and WordPress, where each dual wields for-profit and non-profit institutions in stewardship of their broad productive communities, which are comprised of their projects' contributors and fans. So some of these themes have actually been thought of and attempted before, which leads on to the next book, Cybernetic Revolutionaries by Eden Medina, which tells the story of British cyberneticist and management consultant Stafford Beer, who was tasked to build an organizational utopia for the Chilean government in the years prior to the Pinochet coup from 1971 to 1973. The project was called Cybersin, and Medina recounts the controversies, idiosyncrasies, and fraught politics surrounding its creation in vivid detail. Summarizing Beer's general outlook, Medina writes that Beer's writings on management cybernetics differed from the contemporaneous work taking place in the U.S. military and think tanks such as RAND that led to the development of computer systems for top-down command and control. From the 1950s onward, Beer had drawn from his understanding of the human nervous system to propose a form of management that allowed businesses to adapt quickly to a changing environment. A major theme in Beer's writings was finding a balance between centralized and decentralized control, and in particular how to ensure the stability of the entire firm without sacrificing the autonomy of its component parts. So the actual history of Cybersin's implementation was fraught with difficulty. There were continual undercurrents of political animosity among workers, managers, and politicians, considerable technological constraints, American-led intrigues to depose Allende, fears of technocratic domination from the press, and a simmering incompatibility between Stafford Beer's vision of autonomous self-management and the intent of Allende's government to place larger and larger portions of the economy under state control. Of historical and practical note were a pair of trucker strikes, which both put the Chilean economy in temporary crisis. The part I read this time took place during the second trucker strike, not long before Allende's violent demise. The telex network was once again being used to great effect, and the opposition parties and press publicly decried Cybersin as a form of totalitarian control as a result, while privately members of the opposition embraced the system and wanted to improve its ability to centralize government control. When Allende was ultimately killed, the project would be abandoned. Despite the dismal ending and techno-political tension, I find this whole affair to be uniquely fascinating. If someone were to think along such otherworldly lines again, I wonder what new directions might they take. That question drew me to the next book. So let's talk about Swarm Creativity by Peter A. Glor. This book centers on what Glor calls collaborative innovation networks, or COINs for short. Glor writes that watched individually, members of a coin may appear like individual ants to behave erratically. Like an ant colony, though, the entire coin operates as a highly efficient self-organizing community. Its members communicate in patterns structured as small world and scale-free networks. A coin is a sort of cracked team within a broader collaborative milieu, surrounded by a learning network and an interest network. Glor calls the sum of these three parts collaborative knowledge networks. He writes that there is a natural growth path. A coin extends into a collaborative learning network. This grows into a collaborative information network. That carries a germ of innovation that gives rise to new coins from its different subcommunities. The part I read this time was in Appendix B, which describes a simple method for detecting the emergence of coins. Their method is dynamic SNA, or social network analysis, under the somewhat ungainly moniker temporal communication flow analysis, or TEC-flow for short. It shows animated graphs of communication networks where the closer that two people are placed together, the more intensive their relationship. That is, the more messages they have exchanged. The most active communicators, those who sent and received the most messages, are placed visually in the center of the network. So here they calculate a contribution index, which is just messages sent minus messages received, divided by the messages sent plus the messages received. The y-axis then tracks whether a person is primarily a sender or a receiver, and the x-axis shows the contribution frequency. From here, Glor et al. Glean 4 different role patterns: creators, communicators, collaborators, and knowledge experts. In order to catch the emergence of a coin, they used what is called group betweenness centrality, or GBC, a measure of how much a group communicates to a central figure without communicating with each other, creating hub and spokes structure. He writes that the external part of a coin consists of a network forming a ring around the core team. The coin core team has comparatively high density but low GBC. A CLN or a CIN has lower density but higher GBC, as external members are connected only to core team members but not among themselves, which is exactly what we see visually. From here, the process for detecting a new coin would be 1. Watch TEC-flow communication flow movies to find dense clusters indicating the potential emergence of coins. 2. Look for peaks and troughs in the temporal evolution of GBC and density to find the most interesting phases of collaboration in the team's lifetime. 3. Look at the contribution index to understand better the roles of individuals in teams. This idea seems to me to be trivially implementable, and I imagine that it could provide a massive boost to operational self-awareness in Michel Bowen's non-coercive contexts. In conclusion, I'll quote something that might segue into the next book. Glor writes, perhaps nothing expresses the main motivation for swarm creativity better than something I read on a napkin in a San Francisco restaurant. If you and I swap $1, you and I still each have $1. If you and I swap an idea, you and I have 2 ideas each. By openly sharing ideas and work, a team's creative output is exponentially more than the sum of the creative outputs of all the individual team members. This reminded me of the Swedish proverb, shared joy is double joy, shared sorrow is half sorrow, and speaks to the way that such things as joy, love, and ideas self-multiply. So The Origin of Humanness in the Biology of Love by Umberto Maturana and Gerda Verda-Zoller is a book of systems ecology from the tradition of second-order cybernetics. It can be seen as broadly neo-Lamarckian in orientation, which is an upshot of thinking in terms of niche evolution. Summarizing this view, they write that a lineage of organisms arises when a particular dynamic organism niche relation begins to be conserved as a manner of living from one generation to the next through systemic reproduction. The book contains a number of other departures from the typical understanding, by which token it reminds me a bit of Eva Jablonka's excellent Evolution in 4 Dimensions. Their perspective is that language itself spirals out of the mother-child relationship, only to be further fostered by many human practices of self-replicating, being together, and conviviality. And here it is not language as a noun, but languaging as a verb and a form of living, which articulates itself within a process of emotioning, of which love is a central part, and without which they say languaging would not exist. They define love as a kind of emotioning that completely removes the need of someone else to justify their own existence. Liking or not liking another, according to what one sees without the distortion of a prejudice, and acting in responsibility for one's liking or not liking, are acts in love. Contrary to this, negating another according to what one imagines or supposes or wants the other to be are acts in aggression. From this, they derive a counterintuitive perspective of love as unidirectional, precisely because it needs nothing back. Because of this, love is intrinsically unidirectional and liberates. That is, love lets the other be even in the act of separation. Power, on the other hand, is bidirectional, as it takes place in a relation of domination and submission that entails self-negation of both participants. The one that dominates negates him or herself as an autonomous being by acting as if his or her superiority were intrinsic to him or her, and the one that submits negates him or herself in the act of submission. Relations of power create resentment. Love, as it operates in self-respect and self-acceptance, brings with itself well-being. As to the part I actually read this time, they developed the idea of language as a manner of living in coordination of coordinations. Explore ancestral primates, the evolution of human hands and practices of caressing, the sharing of food, and male participation in childcare. In conclusion, I would just point out that Maturana has a rather unique writing style that tends to build a dense thicket of context by looping back around on itself. For those that have never read him, I'd suggest starting with the more well-known Autopoiesis and Cognition, co-authored with Francisco Varela. So that's it. I've finally gone through all 8 of the books I said I was going to get through way back in video 4. Next time, I'll be discussing these 4. Show Your Work by Austin Kleon, a PhD dissertation titled Noise and Morphogenesis by Miguel Prado, The Aims of Education by Alfred North Whitehead, and more of The Fifth Hammer by Daniel Heller-Rosen. If you find yourself enjoying this kind of thing, please like and subscribe, and feel free to leave any thoughts and insights in the comments section. Until next time.